Welcome to the Medical Imaging for All podcast, brought to you by Clarius Mobile Health. This show is dedicated to exploring the trends and technologies shaping the future of medical imaging. Here's your host, Ohad Arazi, CEO of Clarius Mobile Health. Now, let's jump right into today's episode.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for listening to another episode of our podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Saul, who's a neuro and interventional radiologist, a founder of multiple companies, a healthcare polymath, and currently serves as the head of healthcare and life sciences at Amazon Web Services. Jared, that is a lot. So before we dive into the episode, could you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Well, you've covered the highlights. It's been an interesting journey. I started in clinical practice as a radiologist and specialized in neuroradiology. And I practiced clinically for some time, both in academics and private practice, which was a good and interesting experience. But I've always had a little bit of a dual existence as a tech nerd with entrepreneurial ambitions. So way back in the 90s, when the internet was just becoming a phenomenon, I had an idea to launch a website called petfinder.com that let people use the internet to find an adoptable pet. And it was just like a passion project that kind of took on a life of its own. And by 2000, it was one of the busiest sites on the internet. And we had a whole team and we're doing all kinds of traffic. And it was really, it was great. But I was splitting my time 50%, I guess doing clinical radiology and finishing my training and becoming a practitioner. And, and then by night I was an entrepreneur and a technologist and a CTO and all of these things. And eventually I sold that business and it gave me a chance to think, well, what do I want to do next? And I decided I'd go and try my hand at being an entrepreneur full time and see if I can make that magic happen again. And so that's what I did for a good long while before coming back here to AWS.
Very cool. No, I definitely want to come back to Pet Finder because I love the social networking aspect of that. And I actually think that a lot of that can be applied to healthcare, which is kind of our main focal point today. But maybe first we'll start from that transition from being a radiologist to becoming an entrepreneur. I always loved radiologists like you when I was selling packs, kind of the really techie, geeky radiologists that cared a lot about technology. Very few of them, though, actually make that leap. And actually, I was just on a podcast a few weeks ago, and I went on record saying, to be an entrepreneur, you have to be dumb, deaf, and blind. Because if you knew everything about your business and about the market you're trying to penetrate, you would never do it because you knew the deck was stacked against you. Your odds of success are like infinitesimally small. And yet you did it and you've done it multiple times. Like you're a glutton for punishment. So talk to me about that transition. Like you said, it was kind of a side project, but then it became your main thing. How does it feel to be an entrepreneur?
It's not easy. I think it's in the public mind, it's probably more glamorous than it is in reality. And I found it to be a rewarding experience when things are going well and you're building a new product or a new service or endeavoring in something that's innovative. Like it's just, you're all amped up on adrenaline and exciting and you get out into the wild and people start to use it and it starts to build some momentum. And there's nothing better than that feeling. What you don't see is all the stuff that doesn't work and, all the difficulties and vulnerabilities. I don't think there's a business out there, startup, maybe even beyond startup, where there's not one point of risk where if a big customer or a big outage or a competitor, got some big investment, you wouldn't have an existential threat. And so these things keep you up at night. You're always trying to move from milestone to milestone, goalpost to goalpost, stretching your resources, hiring, the best people you can afford to. And, you got to keep all those balls in the air all the time. Like I said, it's great when it works, but it can be stressful. And, for me, after doing it for about a decade and a half, I was ready for a little break. I'm not saying I wouldn't necessarily do it again, but it's kind of nice to come in out of the wild. I know you've been through it yourself a few times. I really admire that, but, man, it can wear on you. It's also, I think, one thing people don't talk about a lot is for founders, it can be a little bit of a lonely experience. It can be very isolating, focused on your one domain with your team day in and day out. So it can be a little bit of a vacuum, I think. Have you experienced that?
I have. And, I come at it from a different lens, Jared, because I've actually never founded a company. I've come on as an operator and I've had experience taking over for founders, some good, some bad. Maybe I've never had yet the courage to do it, or maybe it's less my DNA. Like I kind of think of myself as I'm good at scaling versus at starting with that very, very initial seed idea. But like you, I still think I've got a lot of runway in my career. Maybe I'll come back to this, but I can really associate to what you're talking about, that loneliness. Certainly being as an operator running a business, you're very lonely. Usually your main, or only friend is your board chair. What I actually found with my current company with Clarius is I came on and took over for the founder, and we've remained really close. And actually, he's kind of my lifeline, and I think at some level, I'm his. Did you ever have that experience? Like when you were a founder, did you ever hand the company over, ultimately give the reins to someone else, but stayed on to support them and to support the growth of the business?
It's a good question. I think my preferred mode of operating is to always have a partner. And I know this is different for different people, but I know my weaknesses, and I really like to be paired with somebody who complements that. And then at least we have each other. That said, I think even with like a good founder, co-founder setup, there is different skills required on the early side of a company and then growing it later. And maybe in some ways, even it's harder when you've got two people to step back and be like, are we the right team to take this forward? Or, should one or both of us consider bringing in somebody new to, commercialize or build or grow or whatever it may be. But I've been very fortunate. I've had great co-founders through the thick and thin of it. That's been the thing that's kept me kind of sane.
That's great. Yeah. And I think you're right. As you work on it together, you have that support network, and maybe then it does become a joint decision to say, have we built the company to the level that now we've kind of replaced ourselves and it's time for someone else? My current founder, Laurent Pellissier, he always says he's like a $0 to $20 million guy. And I think of myself, I'm more like the 20 to 100 million guy. Like I can come and help to scale the company. But again, I haven't yet found that I'm ready for that spark. Maybe we'll come back to this. Maybe I'll come back to it in my career. I would like to talk about Pet Finder for a moment, because from what I read about it, it sounds like a very interesting, social network that you create of people sharing their stories, the pets they're looking for. And that's actually an angle that I felt is really catching on, or I feel is really catching on in healthcare, of like healthcare survivorship, people sharing different stories around their disease states, different stories around how they're overcoming, and it becoming actually a very important tool in kind of the consumerization of healthcare, not from the perspective of necessarily buying, but from sharing. Could you tell us a bit more about Pet Finder, and maybe do you see any corollary to how healthcare is evolving with this kind of the patient or the consumer more at the center of the experience than they've ever been before?
It's a really interesting observation. I hadn't really thought about it that way. With Pet Finder, the mission was helping to get pets adopted that otherwise probably wouldn't have had any real marketing or visibility. And in doing that, you're right. Like what grew around it was a community. It was multiple communities that kind of intersect, because there's the rescue, shelter, animal caretaker side that was really hungry for an outlet to help get their animals adopted and publicize the work they're doing and take some of the burden off of them. So they really embraced it and embraced being able to connect with each other and have more resources through virtue of our network. And then there was the other part of the community, which was people looking for pets, and they had questions and interests and, concerns and hopes and dreams and all these things that, sharing and facilitating was really hugely important. I didn't expect that when we first started it, but as we built out some message boards and forums and chats, they were all phenomenally successful and busy. Maybe too busy, because moderating those things should be a full-time job too. And I think you're right in healthcare. And I guess this is really true these days across the board. People really want to connect around areas of interest, and what's more of a concern and interest universally than like our health and wellness. And I don't know the stats of like how much social media is spent on diet and exercise and disease and health and advocacy, but it's probably a pretty big chunk. I don't know that those things are, purpose built for that use case. And there's probably ways we could do it better. And I think the misinformation thing is probably the most obvious piece of that. But to your point about the consumerization of healthcare, it feels like as practitioners, we haven't embraced the communities and the social media and the ability to reach patients in those forums in a way that, enhances that. Like, why aren't providers part of those conversations? Why does my practice down the road not have a chat room where I can talk to other people with the same things or interface with staff there and have more of an ongoing relationship instead of this point in time, very discrete, sick care model that we have. So I think there's a long way to go, but I think people are telling us what they want. They want to connect through social media. They want to connect through the digital world, and they want to connect around things that interest and concern them. And, I think healthcare would be an obvious fit for that.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you raised, because it sounds like in Pet Finder, it was like a supply and demand equation, right? And that nexus, right? It created a meeting point for these two communities. And it sounds like while in healthcare, we are building maybe communities, support networks of patients in and amongst themselves, and maybe physicians communicating with each other on social media, but maybe bridging the provider to consumer, the patient to physician gap in more of a context of a community, a network, social media is happening less. I totally see that. At Clarius, for example, we actually are really trying to shift the paradigm of selling a medical device to practitioners from like a classic B2B enterprise sale to much more of a B2C purchase. And as a result, we're seeing that our physicians or our practitioners that are buying our ultrasound are treating it like they would like the unboxing experience of like a personal device that they buy. They share it on social media. They talk to others. Here's me and my Clarius. They're sharing images of their Clarius. Again, to your point, less crossing the divide from physician to patient, but still nonetheless an interesting dynamic, that is emerging. And maybe that is a good segue to talking about what you're doing today with Amazon. So first of all, that's a pretty big transition, right? From techie, geeky radiologist to serial entrepreneur, multiple co-founder and exiter, and then joining a big corporate. And I know your job is not a big corporate job, but you work for one of the largest companies in the world. What does that transition look like? And what is it that you actually do with Amazon?
I was just talking to somebody yesterday about this and how I feel like when I joined Amazon, I was like a wild animal coming out from, the forest and landing in like a civilized, environment. The transition from startup to big company is, it's a bit of a culture shock, and it took some time to adjust. My role here at Amazon is to oversee and support the work of all of the startups and investors that participate in our platform and grow their businesses and invest on it. And we've had teams that work with startups since the early days of Amazon. Startups have been a huge part of our business, still are. And over time, like everybody else, we've realized, hey, healthcare and other industry-specific areas, there's a language, there's a trust that you have to build. These are long-term relationships. And having people on our side who really get it and can be advisors and partners to our customers is really important to earn their trust. So my team and I, that's basically what we do. We spend time getting to know companies globally, working in healthcare and life sciences. So it's a very broad mandate. And figure out where we can connect resources and technology and leverage our network, the broader Amazon reach to support our customers. We can't do everything for everybody, but we try to deliver what we can, and I think it's really important for companies to see that there's folks on this side of the table who get it, who've been there, who've done the entrepreneurial journey, and are kind of here to support them.
Yeah, and I can see that you're extremely good at connecting with startups coming from that background. But I've also been following AWS, and I see that you have some very profound relationships with big enterprises, with large health systems, with payers. And that's really interesting, kind of maybe back in line with my point around, moving kind of healthcare consumerization. And is that a journey that has been difficult for big enterprises that I think historically, getting their head wrapped around a cloud service is non-trivial, right? They're used to kind of having their hands wrapped around physical assets, maintaining control. How have you found that transition of getting enterprises onto the cloud?
It's a journey. It's true across all industries. Healthcare, I think, is especially slow moving, and rightly so, right? It's not the same as maybe some direct to consumer retail things where being out in the front is a little easier, a little less risky. So healthcare moves very slowly, very deliberately, and it's taken time. It's taken time for enterprises to see the value in moving from the traditional models. Some of the longstanding legacy vendors, they've invested heavily in that architecture and hardware and software and licenses and developing teams to support that. And the change management around switching those pieces and parts is tough. So there's financial, there's cultural, there's territorial reasons to keep with the status quo. But over the arc of time, you can see that having data centers in hospitals, racking and stacking servers, just like it doesn't make a lot of sense for other industries, it doesn't really make sense for hospitals to be in that business, and pharma companies, and there's so many efficiencies of scale that you gain from moving to the cloud, and you get, much more secure and reliable infrastructure. So I think the value has really been pretty obvious, and now we're at kind of like, it's just a matter of how we get from A to B. So it's not a question of if or should we, it's just like how fast and exactly what does that look like.
When I was at ZebraMed, we were using AWS as well to run our machine learning algorithms and selling it to the big enterprises. And I found that many of the points you made resonated well with them. They said, well, it doesn't make sense to maintain server farms. And they were already making other changes to move from CapEx to OpEx, which is almost a religious shift, right? Especially when you involve the CFO's office. Where I found that they needed the most convincing, though, was around data privacy. And in particular, healthcare enterprises, I think, started to realize maybe in the mid 2010s, in the last kind of decade or so, that they're sitting on this huge asset and this huge responsibility also of maintaining patient information. And I think they felt, initially at least, that much of the vendor community was monetizing on their behalf, right? They were training and validating their algorithms based on the provider's data, which they're the custodians of on behalf of the patients. Is that something that you've also found? And just kind of as part of this journey, how do we take that next step of helping providers to overcome data use rights, finding that balance between the patient's rights, what the provider's looking to do with the data, what the vendor's looking to data, and maybe the common good of knowing that aggregated, de-identified information can rapidly accelerate cure, can rapidly accelerate development of novel therapies or new solutions? Like, how do you balance all those balls in the air?
So there's a few pieces of that to tease out. The security aspect, that's priority zero for everybody in this space. And I think you're right. Hospitals and, health systems, people operating in the healthcare space are super focused on that and need to develop the trust that their data is going to be protected. The reality is, as you look at cloud versus on-prem or traditional data centers or whatever the model was, it's hard to have as much security and controls in place on a one-off data center or on-prem system as you get as part of the package in a cloud platform. And I think 3 or 4 years ago, that wasn't as obvious to people as it is now. But with all the security breaches and ransomware attacks, all these kinds of things, there's been a real shift in thinking, and people realize like managing it yourself is overwhelming, and moving it to the cloud, you get all these benefits of being able to scale and resiliency and backups and, security and all this stuff. So I think we've crossed that bridge of like, is it secure? Is it safe? Is the data going to be protected? Mm-hmm. The other thing you're talking about is who owns the data, and if the data is going to be used to develop products or, for population health or whatever it is, like, what's that look like? What's those data rights look like? And, it's a really interesting area of discussion and debate. I don't know that there's a right answer. I have my own opinions, but I think we still have a long way to go. The model that most people have been operating under is that the provider owns the data and can kind of decide what to do with it. Most providers who have projects that involve patient data do take measures to de-identify it. And I think, generally speaking, across the industry, that's kind of considered to be the bar. But it's a really interesting question to consider what the patient rights are and also the clinician's rights. And there's been cases where clinicians have done a lot of the work doing the diagnosis, even labeling data, alongside their job. And maybe that finds its way into an enterprise or product, a startup, and they may not be getting compensated or, credits for it. Maybe patients and clinicians and everybody along that chain should get some value out of it. I don't know where this is all going to end, but this is one of many issues that, we're really just starting to appreciate the scope of, and I think have some healthy debates around.
Agreed. And I know you're at the forefront of engaging with the startup community on AI and machine learning, especially in medical imaging, which is a field that both of us come from and was really one of the early adopters of AI in healthcare because so much of medical imaging was digitized and because we had standard protocols like DICOM to be able to share those images. The industry is now starting to move, I think, from kind of the hype to maybe reality. And the rubber's starting to hit the road where we've been in this for about 10 years now of having AI medical imaging startups. And certainly some value is there. Some of companies have been highly, highly valued. We've seen a few exits. But generally, kind of what do you see as the state of the union of the imaging AI space from where you sit, where you have such a broad lens to see all the diversity of vendors in this area?
I should flip this question back around to you, but I'll take a stab at it first. Totally agree that this has been the forefront of AI in healthcare has been radiology. It's probably been the case for about 10 years. And there's been some growing pains, sort of what I call first generation imaging AI companies. I think more or less there's been some exits, but there's also been a lot of struggles and consolidation. Part of it is really unsexy stuff around how hard is it to integrate these solutions into your workflow? How many point solutions can you have in a radiology workflow? How does a radiologist interact with these algorithms? Do they trust them? And at the end of the day, like who's paying for it and what's the value proposition? These have been very murky. I think people were a little blinded by the potential and got excited at the accuracy and power of some of these algorithms. And the business lagged a little bit. And the realities of like what it looks like to sell into a hospital system and infiltrate a workflow were maybe underappreciated. We've not only gone through generation one, I'd say we've maybe gone through the second generation of medical imaging AI startups, which I would describe as point solutions are tough. So a platform that hosts a lot of different solutions is maybe a more palatable proposition. And there are a lot of companies that do this, and I think it makes a ton of sense. But some of those pain points are still just as much of an issue. How do we pay for it? What's the ROI? How's it integrate with the workflow? Who's deciding which algorithms we use? How do we integrate it across, our system, our PAC system? And now I think we're entering this third phase where the technology is overwhelmingly compelling. Physicians are burning out. Radiology volumes are going up. In a lot of the world, there's not enough clinicians to service the demand. And the only way I think we can move forward is to really embrace this technology and put it right in the middle of these workflows. And whether you're doing it to scale your business financially in some of these mega radiology groups, it's obvious if you could even get a couple percentages of more efficiency for your radiologists because you prioritize the cases or you smart route them or you're doing a first pass and finding, abnormalities, like that pays off. If it's quality of care, having a second reading or something else looking over your shoulder, that also pays off in different ways. But also there's this whole other area of imaging related AI, which is more workflow related. Like how do you make the reporting process quicker? How do you associate the proper billing codes? How do you make sure the follow-up exams are, flagged and, the outreach and the loop is closed with patients? It's not necessarily as appealing or sexy as the imaging side, but if we can demonstrate value in those areas where it's a little bit higher reward, lower risk, then I think you open the door for more and more of these applications to expand across the reading room. And I think that's where we're at now, is a sort of inflection point.
No, I definitely agree with your workflow comment. In many ways, I liken imaging AI to like the autopilot on a long transatlantic flight, right? Where like the really sexy jobs are like the takeoff and the landing. And actually, I would prefer to have a human in the controls there. But it's a lot of the really mundane, like 12 hours of like being up in the air and just keeping, the flight on track, where I'm happy that we're not creating fatigue for the pilot by having the machine do more of that automation. And I think that's your point around workflow, is a lot of these things that are maybe less to do with the diagnosis itself, but maybe all the workflow around it, right? Annotating it accurately, having consistent measurements, eliminating operator variability, ensuring that the codes are tracked, the report has all of the right side, left side, all those things, I think are where AI will continue to provide value. As you know, I've been in and around this for a long time and also have struggled at some level. In many ways, my most recent endeavor now in ultrasound, I found the role of real-time AI in imaging to be really compelling. Ultrasound is quite different because most of AI, if you think about kind of traditional modalities of X-ray, CT, MR, mammography, AI is doing post-processing. The technologist is acquiring the image, and then either before the radiologist or the cardiologist read it, or as an aid to their actual interpretation, AI comes into play once the image is acquired. And actually in ultrasound, what we found is the biggest value point in AI is real time, is to help acquire the image, because ultrasound acquisition is actually quite difficult. It requires a lot of proficiency. So that could also be a breakthrough that we're looking at right now, is how to use AI to better acquire in real time, somewhat gamify the experience, rotate left, rotate right, boom, now you've acquired the perfect image. But I agree that it's maybe we're now in that third generation or kind of that third inflection point of now being focusing on ROI, because like you said, the technology has proven itself, the interest is there, maybe some of the initial hurdles of scale, integration, working with health systems have weeded out some of the competitors and cost consolidation. And now with the third inflection point, what we'll see is the actual value realization and maybe more of the platform play, even though I think just with platforms, the risk is always, how do you avoid it becoming like an Uber Eats takeout menu, where it's like, well, I could have like the Kung Pao chicken and then like the Mediterranean wrap, but those are two like very different flavors, right? And so if I'm a radiologist, it's hard to work with those two things in the same palette. And therefore, like interoperability and integration of multiple solutions into a platform will have to be really seamlessly done. So you actually have that full 7-course meal is really satisfying from end to finish, right? And isn't overly eclectic.
Yeah, I like that analogy. That's exactly right. And I also think you're dead on with ultrasound. It's often underappreciated how difficult ultrasonography can be. And having some assistance to get more consistent scans and maybe upskill people who are novices or maybe not ultrasonographers is a really compelling use case for sure.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad we're touching on this. You know that I'm a lifelong ultrasound geek, and would be happy to actually talk a little bit about your perspective of what we're seeing with handheld ultrasound, right? Because you've been in imaging for a long time, and I'd say traditionally radiologists actually kind of hated handheld ultrasound. They treated it as a toy. They're like, well, it's kind of like subpar image quality. It's like this kind of nice little tricorder style Star Trek tool. But actually, if we're ever to use it, we need the real thing. And I think that approach is changing. And certainly you're seeing that handheld ultrasound is focusing much more on point of care use cases than on traditional radiology or cardiology settings where you already have high-end carts and also you have sonographers that are doing the image acquisition. Well, what's your take on this general push of miniaturizing ultrasound and making it much more accessible? Is it ultimately going to replace the stethoscope and be in the pocket of every physician?
I think I was looking at your website, maybe your podcast list, and somewhere you said something about like ultrasonography is the new stethoscope. And I think that's exactly the right framework to think about. For radiologists who are doing, complex fetal anatomy scans and other things, there is always a place for like the best of the best equipment. And you should know that you could send patients to get like the highest quality possible scan with the highest quality and most qualified people both doing and interpreting the study. But there's this whole other part of medicine where we've been operating, I don't want to say blindly, but with really archaic tooling. And there's better stuff out there. A handheld ultrasound just to help place IVs, guide aspirations, listen to the lungs or the heart, and we'll look to see if there's fluid. Something as simple as a pleural effusion or a pericardial effusion, why not spot that right in the exam and not leave it up to like the auscultative capabilities of the primary care physician or the nurse? Like, that's crazy to me. I've used the stethoscope for a year. I could never tell anything on that. It's like an art, And they've done these studies with people, with med students and residents at Mass General. Well, they did it years ago, and the consistency between people using stethoscopes was so low. You may as well have just made stuff up, really. We've got technology that can do this, and the price point, the form factor that you're operating at, I think the potential is endless. And, you and I have talked about some of the smaller niches where it's especially obvious, like fertility, checking follicles, these very repetitive, simple things where you could probably teach even the patient to do it themselves. and remove a huge amount of burden and barrier to access that currently exists.
Yeah, and I think that really aligns with a lot of the tailwinds we're seeing in healthcare, where we're trying to move away from this physician-centered care model, from this hospital-centered care model. And I think that is like the dissemination of, information and access to care. And part of that comes with medical devices, which I think is not easy for us being in this more traditional healthcare space to let go of, right? Because we're used to like, whoa, this is like medical equipment. It could only ever be operated by someone who's got like 10 years of training on how to use this thing. But the reality is that everything we just discussed of web services and cloud computing and AI are all enablers that are lowering that hurdle rate. And that's the journey that I think handheld ultrasound is on, is from radiology and cardiology, which is the genesis of ultrasound, to other practitioners that are using it in a variety of care settings and eliminating some of the variability that you have with palpations or with stethoscopes. And then ultimately, they're putting it in the hands of less trained practitioners and even allied health professionals, which we're already seeing today, and ultimately in the hands of patients. And of course, we have to get the regulator there. We have to do it in a way that the intended use is controlled and it's safe and effective. But I think that's where it's heading. And I think that is what will help to unburden the health system from a lot of the cost and the centric approach that it's had. And I think eliminate this over dependence on referrals, right? Today, kind of everything you have to refer out to a specialist, where many more tools, I think, could be closer to the patient, closer to the point of care.
Absolutely. I mean, simplifying the healthcare journey, removing some of these referrals, ping-ponging patients around between their doctor, their lab tests, their imaging, and then back to figure out what it all showed before they get any kind of answers. It's not very efficient. It's not very good. And, yes, there's reasons to be cautious in adopting new technologies like point of care ultrasound, but also think about where we're starting from. Like, we're not in a great place now, and the incremental benefits are there to be immediately realized of adopting some of these things. So I'd say it's almost, a dereliction of duties to not push some of these things forward. There are people who'd be benefiting from it right now.
Amen to that. Jared, we're on this journey together of driving innovation into healthcare. I tremendously enjoyed speaking with you today. Just before we wrap, if our audience wants to find out more about you and your work, where should they go?
I feel like I should have a YouTube video or something. But LinkedIn is probably the easiest thing to find me on, just Jared Saul, and I'll pop up. Or I can give my email address. I'm always happy to get emails. And that's just jmsaul@amazon.com.
Excellent. Thank you for everything today, Jared. I really enjoyed our time together.
Well, thank you. It was a real pleasure talking to you.
And to all of our listeners, as always, we appreciate you spending time with us. Be sure to catch us on the next episode of our podcast. That's a wrap. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Medical Imaging for All podcast, brought to you by Clarius. If you enjoyed today's show, please do us a favor and leave us a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. For the latest episodes, please visit www.clarius.com or search Medical Imaging for All on your podcast platform of choice. Thanks again, and we'll catch you on the next episode.